The airplane cabin was a symphony of clicking seatbelts and slamming bins. In the middle of the crowd sat a man who belonged to another world. Wearing a worn leather jacket, his arms were a canvas of dark, faded tattoos. He sat in absolute silence, a cold shadow in the room. Passengers paused, checked their numbers, and moved on with visible discomfort. A mother pulled her child away. A businessman requested a last-minute seat change. The biker didn't react, his hands resting quietly on his knees. Suddenly, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Is there a combat veteran on board?" Through the cockpit door, his eyes locked onto that exact row. Jack Turner was 38 years old, but his eyes held the weight of a century. He was a man defined by the long, lonely stretches of highway he traversed on his vintage motorcycle. To the world, he was just another nomad, a drifter with grease under his fingernails, and a rugged exterior that discouraged conversation. He worked freelance jobs, fixing engines in small towns before disappearing back into the horizon. Jack didn't talk much because he had spent a decade in a place where words were a luxury and silence was a survival skill. His physical frame was powerful, a testament to years of rigorous training and the harsh reality of life in an elite special operations unit. The tattoos that snaked up his neck and down his forearms were not for fashion. They were maps of a life he had tried to bury. They covered the jagged white lines of shrapnel scars and the circular marks of old bullet wounds. Jack had served in the most dangerous corners of the globe, part of a unit that didn't officially exist. He had left the military after a mission that ended in a tragedy he couldn't forget. There had been no parades for him. There were no gleaming medals pinned to his chest in front of a cheering crowd. There was only a quiet discharge and a backpack full of memories that he never shared with anyone. The civilian world often felt like a foreign country to Jack. He struggled with the triviality of modern life, the way people complained about slow internet or cold coffee, while he remembered the taste of iron and the smell of gunpowder. He had tried to fit in, taking a steady job at a local garage, but the walls felt like they were closing in on him. Every ticking clock sounded like a fuse, and every sudden noise made his hand reach for a sidearm that was no longer there. The hypervigilance was a constant companion, a shadow that never left his side. It was a restless energy that hummed beneath his skin, making the stagnant air of the cabin feel heavy and suffocating. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers burning into the back of his neck, a familiar heat that he had learned to ignore long ago. The roar of his motorcycle was the only thing that could drown out the intrusive thoughts that surfaced in the quiet hours of the night. On the road, he wasn't a broken soldier. He was just a man moving through space, disconnected from the expectations of society. This flight was a rare necessity, a forced entry into a bubble of humanity that he spent most of his time avoiding. He knew the protocol. Sit still, look ahead, and wait for the journey to end. He didn't expect kindness, and he certainly didn't expect to be seen for who he truly was. To everyone else, he was a mystery wrapped in leather, but to himself, he was a man just trying to stay afloat in a sea of ghosts. Jack was on this flight today for one reason only. He was heading to a memorial service for a brother in arms, a man who had saved his life at the cost of his own. Jack chose to sit still, staring out the window at the gray wing of the aircraft. He was used to the avoidance. He had seen the way people crossed the street when they saw him coming. He had felt the silent judgment in grocery stores and gas stations. The fearful glances from the other passengers didn't make him angry anymore. He had learned that people were afraid of what they didn't understand, and they certainly didn't understand the man beneath the leather jacket. The fear in their eyes was simply a reminder that the war had never truly left him. It lived in the way he tracked the exits. It lived in the way he kept his back to the wall. It lived in the crushing weight of the silence he carried. He was a ghost among the living, a soldier without a war, trying to find a way to honor the dead in a world that didn't know how to look him in the eye. The flight was reaching its cruising altitude when the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. A young flight attendant, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly, walked past Jack's row for the 4th time. She didn't offer him a drink. She didn't ask if he was comfortable. She just stole a quick, nervous glance at his tattoos before scurrying back to the galley. Jack could hear the whispers from the row behind him. "Is he safe?" a woman hissed to her husband. "Look at those scars on his neck. He looks like he just walked out of a prison yard." The husband shifted in his seat, nodding in agreement. "I'm glad there's an empty seat between us," he whispered back. "You never know with people like that." Jack heard every word. His hearing was still sharp, a remnant of nights spent listening for footsteps in the dark. He didn't turn around. He didn't defend himself. He had learned long ago that words were useless against prejudice. The judgment felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He watched as a businessman in the next aisle shifted his posture, clearly trying to create more distance between them. It was a silent ballet of exclusion. The man even checked his expensive watch repeatedly, as if time spent near Jack was somehow more dangerous. He adjusted his silk tie with a nervous twitch, never once making eye contact. Jack understood the mechanics of it. He was the outlier, the predator in a flock of sheep. They saw the rough edges, the ink, and the weathered leather, and they saw a threat. They didn't see the man who had spent 3 days in a muddy trench to ensure their safety. They didn't see the man who had held his friend's hand as the light left his eyes. To them, he was a stereotype, a character from a gritty movie that they hoped would never enter their real lives. Jack leaned back, feeling the vibration of the engines through the seat. He focused on his breathing, using the tactical techniques he had mastered under pressure to maintain his composure. He was a master of self-control, a silent observer in a world that was too loud, too superficial, and far too quick to condemn what it could not categorize. Instead of reacting, Jack reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It was a picture of 4 young soldiers standing in front of a Humvee, their faces covered in dust, but their smiles bright with the arrogance of youth. They looked invincible. They looked like brothers. Jack's thumb traced the face of the man on the far left. That was Elias. Elias was the one who wouldn't be at the memorial because the memorial was for him. Jack felt a sharp, familiar pang in his chest. He remembered how Elias always shared his rations and how they had promised to ride their bikes across the country once they were back. That promise now felt like a lead weight in his stomach. The paper of the photo was thin and frayed at the edges, much like Jack's own tether to the civilian world. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his heart rate. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the sound of Elias's laughter, something that was becoming harder to recall with each passing year. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, rattling the overhead bins. The passengers gasped, but Jack didn't flinch. He had flown through anti-aircraft fire. A little wind was nothing. Suddenly, a sharp electronic chime echoed through the cabin. It wasn't the usual seatbelt sign. It was the emergency alert from the cockpit. The flight attendants froze in their tracks. They exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated panic. The lead attendant rushed toward the intercom, her voice cracking as she tried to maintain a professional tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened, she said. But the fear in her eyes told a different story. A moment later, the captain's voice came over the speaker. This is the captain speaking. We have a medical emergency in the flight deck. Is there a doctor or a combat veteran on board? The request was unusual, specific, and terrifying. The cabin went deathly silent. People looked around, their eyes wide with confusion. A combat veteran? Why would they need a soldier in the cockpit? The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. No one stood up. The businessman who had requested a seat change stared at his shoes. The young mother gripped her child's hand. The judgment that had filled the cabin only minutes ago was replaced by a paralyzing fear. The silence was broken by the sound of metal clicking. Jack Turner had unbuckled his seatbelt. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as the biker stood up. He was taller than he looked while sitting, his broad shoulders filling the narrow aisle. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had seen too much. He didn't say a word to the people staring at him. He didn't look at the woman who had called him a prisoner. He simply walked toward the front of the plane with a steady, purposeful gait. The lead flight attendant met him at the galley, her eyes darting between his tattoos and his calm expression. I'm a combat veteran, Jack said. His voice was low, gravelly, and completely devoid of ego. He didn't explain his rank. He didn't list his qualifications. He just stated the fact. The attendant nodded quickly and swiped her keycard, ushering him into the cockpit. Inside the small, cramped space of the flight deck, the situation was dire. The co-pilot was slumped over in his seat, his face a terrifying shade of blue. The captain was struggling to maintain control of the aircraft while simultaneously trying to check the co-pilot's pulse. The cockpit was filled with the rhythmic beeping of sensors and the heavy smell of ozone. Jack didn't hesitate. He stepped into the small space and immediately began to work. He didn't ask for permission. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent his life in high-pressure medical situations. He checked the co-pilot's airway and felt for a carotid pulse. He recognized the symptoms immediately. This wasn't just a faint. This was a severe neurogenic shock, a condition Jack had seen dozens of times on the battlefield when a soldier's body simply couldn't handle the physical and mental stress of a trauma. Jack began issuing orders in a calm, authoritative voice. "Get me the emergency oxygen and the medical kit, now," he told the flight attendant. He turned to the captain. "Keep the plane level, don't worry about him. I've got him." The captain looked at Jack, and for a split second, he saw the tattoos and the leather. But then he saw the eyes. He saw the cold, calculated focus of a professional. The captain nodded and turned back to the controls. Jack worked with a speed that was almost supernatural. He administered a precise dose of epinephrine from the flight kit and began manual resuscitation. He spoke to the unconscious co-pilot, calling him back from the edge just like he used to call his men back in the desert. "Stay with me, son," Jack whispered. "You're not dying on my watch, not today." The chaos of the cockpit was a familiar environment for Jack. He had always been at his best when the world was falling apart. While the captain wrestled with the flight controls, Jack was performing a delicate dance of trauma medicine in a space no larger than a closet. Every alarm was a beat in a song he knew by heart. He monitored the co-pilot's blood pressure manually, using a cuff from the kit while stabilizing the man's neck against the vibration of the plane. He could feel the eyes of the flight attendant on him, her expression a mix of awe and terror. She saw the way his tattooed hands, once considered a sign of rebellion, were now the only thing keeping a man from the grave. The cabin outside felt 1,000,000 miles away, a different reality compared to the life and death struggle happening within these narrow walls. Jack didn't notice her gaze. His world had narrowed down to the rising and falling of a chest and the flicker of an eyelid. He was back in the zone, that timeless state where instinct and training took over, leaving no room for fear or doubt. The metallic taste of adrenaline was in his mouth, a flavor he hadn't tasted in years, but one his body remembered with chilling clarity. He was a machine of survival, efficient and unwavering. The minutes felt like hours. In the main cabin, the passengers were huddled in their seats, listening to the muffled sounds of the struggle behind the cockpit door. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew the man they had judged was the only thing standing between them and a disaster. The whispers had stopped. The fear had turned into a desperate hope. Back in the cockpit, the co-pilot's chest finally heaved. A ragged, gasping breath filled the small space. His eyes flickered open, confused and terrified, but he was alive. Jack held his head steady, his tattooed hands surprisingly gentle. "You're okay," Jack said. "Just breathe." The captain let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked over at Jack, his face etched with a profound sense of relief. "Thank you, soldier," the captain said, his voice thick with emotion. Jack didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just checked the co-pilot's vitals one last time and began to pack up the medical kit. He had done his job. He didn't need a medal, and he didn't need a thank you. He just needed to go back to his seat and finish the flight. When the cockpit door finally opened, the cabin was silent. Jack stepped out, his leather jacket squeaking as he moved. He looked tired, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He didn't look at anyone as he began the walk back to row 12. But as he passed the first few rows, something incredible happened. A passenger stood up and gave a small, respectful nod. Then another. Then another. By the time Jack reached his row, half the cabin was standing. There were no cheers, no applause, just a profound, heavy silence of absolute respect. The woman who had pulled her child away earlier now stood with her head bowed, her eyes filled with tears of shame and gratitude. The businessman who had moved his seat stood by the aisle, blocking Jack's path for a moment. He reached out a hand, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I was wrong." Jack looked at the man's hand, then up at his face. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel superior. He simply felt a strange sense of peace. He took the man's hand and gave it a firm, brief shake. "It's okay," Jack said. "You didn't know." He moved past the man and sat back down in seat 12B. The seat next to him was still empty, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a space of honor. A few minutes later, the young flight attendant who had been so afraid of him approached the row. She didn't scurry past this time. She leaned down and placed a small tray of coffee and a warm meal on his tray table. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" she asked, her voice soft and full of genuine care. Jack looked up and gave her a small, tired smile. "No, thank you," he said. "I'm fine." As the plane continued its journey, the energy in the cabin remained transformed. The people around Jack were no longer trying to look through him. They were looking at him with a quiet sense of wonder. The air itself felt different, no longer heavy with suspicion, but light with gratitude. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed less harsh, replaced by a collective sense of shared humanity. The mother who had been so fearful now allowed her toddler to wave at him. Jack waved back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He realized that the leather jacket and the tattoos were still there, but the wall he had built around himself had started to crumble. He had allowed people to see the soldier inside the biker, and in return, they had allowed him to be a human being again. The silence that followed was not one of exclusion, but of inclusion. He felt a sense of belonging that had eluded him since he left the service. He wasn't just a passenger, he was a protector, and they knew it. The air in the cabin felt lighter. The tension dissipated into a shared appreciation for the man they had so quickly dismissed. He was no longer the man to be avoided. He was the center of their collective safety. A small boy in the row across from him was staring at Jack with wide, wondering eyes. He wasn't afraid. He was mesmerized. He looked at the tattoos on Jack's arm, and then up at his face. "Are you a superhero?" the boy asked in a loud, clear voice. The cabin went silent again. Jack looked at the boy, and then at the mother, who was watching with a mixture of pride and nervousness. "No, kid," Jack said. "I'm just a guy who knows how to fix things." The boy nodded solemnly, as if that was the most impressive thing he had ever heard. Jack turned his head back to the window. The clouds were glowing with the light of the setting sun, a brilliant tapestry of gold and orange. For the first time in years, the memories of the war didn't feel like a burden. They felt like a foundation. He realized that the scars and the tattoos were not just reminders of pain. They were proof that he had survived, and that he still had the power to save others. The silence in the cabin was no longer a weapon of judgment. It was a blanket of protection. Jack closed his eyes and let the steady hum of the engines lull him into a peaceful sleep, knowing that for one brief moment, he was no longer a ghost. He was a man. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, the tires screeching briefly against the tarmac. The tension that had defined the flight was gone, replaced by a quiet, communal sense of relief. As the passengers began to gather their belongings, there was no rushing. There was no pushing. People moved with a strange, newfound politeness. They looked at each other, acknowledging the shared experience they had just survived. The co-pilot was met at the gate by a team of paramedics, and as he was wheeled away on a stretcher, he gave a weak thumbs up to the crowd. A small cheer broke out, but it quickly faded into a respectful murmur as the captain stepped out of the cockpit. He didn't go to his office. He didn't talk to the ground crew. He walked straight to row 12. The captain stopped in front of Jack Turner. He was a man with 30 years of flight experience, a veteran of the skies, but he looked humble in front of the biker. The captain stood at attention and offered a crisp, formal military salute. The entire cabin went still. No one reached for their phones to record the moment. No one tried to take a selfie. It was a private, sacred moment between two men who understood the weight of responsibility. Jack stood up, his leather jacket heavy on his shoulders, and returned the salute with a perfect, practiced motion. "Thank you for being on my flight, Turner," the captain said. "We owe you our lives." Jack simply nodded. "Just doing my job, Captain." He grabbed his small duffel bag and his metal toolbox, moving toward the exit. Walking through the terminal, Jack felt a strange lightness in his step. The airport, usually a place of anonymity and stress, felt different. He noticed the veterans' pins on older men's lapels and the weary smiles of travelers, and he felt a connection he hadn't felt in years. He realized that the world wasn't just divided into sheep and wolves, it was filled with people who were just as afraid and just as hopeful as he was. He didn't need to hide anymore. He had found a way to bridge the gap between his past and his present. He passed a gift shop and saw his reflection in the glass window. He didn't look like a threat anymore. He looked like a guardian who had finally come home. The city beyond the airport gates felt less like a battlefield and more like a destination. Every person he passed was a life worth saving, and every moment was a gift he no longer took for granted. He felt the weight of Elias's photo in his pocket, but it no longer felt like a ghost. It felt like a guiding light. As Jack stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he felt the cool air of the city on his face. He was no longer the biker that everyone avoided. He was just a man walking through a crowded airport. He saw the way people looked at him, and while some still showed a hint of curiosity, the fear was gone. He walked to the parking garage where his motorcycle was stored. He uncovered the machine, the chrome gleaming under the industrial lights. He kicked the engine over, the deep, rhythmic rumble echoing through the concrete structure. It was a sound of power and freedom. He pulled on his helmet, clicked the visor shut, and rolled out onto the open road. Jack drove through the city and out into the countryside, the wind whipping past him. He felt lighter than he had in decades. He understood now that he didn't need the world to understand him. He didn't need to explain his scars or justify his silence. He knew who he was. He was a man who had faced the darkness and refused to let it win. He was a soldier who had found a new way to serve. As he rode toward the memorial for Elias, he knew he could finally stand in front of his friend's grave with his head held high. He hadn't just honored the dead, he had protected the living. The biker who learned to stay quiet had finally found his voice, not through words, but through action. And as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, Jack Turner rode into the night, a silent guardian of the highway, no longer afraid of his own shadow. High TL Stories. If you believe that character is destiny, and that a single act of courage can rewrite your entire life story, then join us at High TL Stories. We share the journeys of the quiet heroes who prove that kindness and bravery are the ultimate powers. Subscribe now to hear more tales of hope, justice, and the incredible ways the world rewards those who refuse to look away when it matters most. Let these stories be your compass when the world feels cold, and remember that your goodness is never a waste of time. Your journey to finding the light starts here.